What's up nerds, Heartless here. In today's video, I'll put to rest once and for all the question that many of you have been asking. Does Saphiron need frost resistance, and if so, how much? For the past couple of months, players have started preparing in one way or another for the release of Naxx, the next and last 40-man raid that is scheduled for Classic WoW. And you can't talk about Naxx without mentioning frost resistance. But is frost resistance really needed? I mean, after all, a lot of players thought that nature resistance is going to be a must for who run in AQ40, and while it is used by some guilds, there are many who don't use it at all and just plow through her. So, is frost resistance on the same level as nature res, or will it be an actual gate that guilds will need to farm for? I guess there's only one way to find out. Math. In order to be able to map out the Saphiron fight, we must first go over all of his abilities. First, Saphiron will cast Blizzard once every 16 seconds that lasts for 15 seconds. This is a large AoE spell that hits for up to 4k frost damage and will move around the room. His second ability is Life Drain, a curse that lasts for 12 seconds and deal up to 2250 shadow damage and heals Saphiron for twice as much. He will cast this around once every 25 seconds. His third ability is Frost Aura, which will deal 600 damage every 2 seconds to everyone in the raid. His fourth ability is Ice Bolt, which he will cast while airborne. This ability will hit a random target and everyone within 10 yards of him for up to 3.3k frost damage. It will also encase the main target with Ice Block that also acts as a line of sight object. Saphiron's last ability is Frost Breath, a slow-moving spirit bomb that, when it reaches the floor, will hit everyone within line of sight for about 120k damage. It will also shatter the ice block players right after. Saphiron will go airborne 45 seconds into the fight and once every 60 seconds after each time he lands, until 10%, at which point he will no longer take flight. Essentially, 35% of the time, on average, Saphiron will be airborne, which means our DPS efficiency is down by 17.5%. Alright then, time to crunch some numbers. Saphiron has 3,164,450 HP, and unlike Huhuran, we're not talking about a short phase here, where the raid needs to burn 300k HP in a few seconds before getting overwhelmed. Instead, we can already see that this is an endurance fight, because even with 0 frost resistance, it will take a casual guild with 10,000 DPS 383 seconds to defeat Saphiron, or 6 minutes and 23 seconds. A fairly long fight. This brings me to the main problem here, healers. You see, there are two problems here that healers must tackle. First, the healing itself, and second is mana management. Saphiron's damage output is simple to calculate. 40 players times 300 damage per second gives us a total of 12,000 DTPS by the raid. That does not include damage taken by the curse or damage taken by the tank, from melees and cleave, which will be at around 700 DTPS. Overall, I'd say we're looking at around 13,000 DTPS by the whole raid from everything. Casual guilds will have around 3,000 HPS total, though that will last for about 5 minutes since healers will simply go at that point. But that won't matter. You see, with 3000 HPS, we're looking at about 75 HPS available per player, and with an average of 325 DTPS by each player, we're looking at a net of 250 DTPS per player. Mages with 4000 HP, for example, will only live for 16 seconds, and warriors with 6000 HP will survive for a bit longer, only 24 seconds. And yes, I did not include greater frost protection potions and the such, because the point is, the raid will be long dead before the healers go. But what if we add more healers? Well, Saphiron has 15 minutes in rage time, which means that the DPS requirement is 3,517 total, or base of 4,263 DPS, which is of course way lower than our 10k baseline. In fact, it's almost half, meaning we can theoretically drop half of our DPS and replace them with healers. So let's do that. With a setup of 1 main tank and 29 DPS, 15 DPS and 24 healers, we're looking at a total of 13,000 DTPS. Divided by 24, it will give us 542 HPS for our healers. Is 542 HPS sustainable for 15 minutes? It's not. So even going to the extreme and maximizing healers, we can see that it's not the right approach. Our goal here is to find the right balance between HPS output and DTPS to make sure our healers never reach the point where they're Alright, so as we've established earlier, we're looking at about 325 DTPS, and our goal is to reduce that number to 75 DTPS, or reduce damage taken by 77%. But that's not possible. First, the highest average resistance the player can reach is 75%, and second, our healers and tank will not be wearing almost any frost resistance gear. So what is enough? What is the bare minimum HPS output that a guild needs to be able to get away with 75% damage reduction? Before we can calculate this, we need to remember that our tank will have no frost resistance at all, and that our healers will have very little, if at all. On average, we're looking at about 60 frost resistance for our healers. I'll also assume 1 main tank, 10 healers, and 29 DPS in our setup. So our tank will be taking 700 DPS physical damage plus 300 DPS from the frost aura, and our healers will receive 258 DPS each. Then we have the rest of the raid that will be taking 75 DPS each. Combining those numbers and averaging them out will give us a total DPS of 5,755, which means each healer will need to output 575.5 HPS. Even if they'd go with 12 healers, the average HPS would be 510. But for the sake of this video, let's say they will be able to output this, which means that at most we're looking at around 5 minutes until the healers will go due to mana mismanagement and improper downranking. Alright then, so we know casual healers will not be able to keep up with the DPS. But what about the DPS? Can casuals at least meet the minimum requirement before the 15 minutes in rage? How long can we expect the fight to last wearing full frost resistance gear? Well, wearing full FRR gear, we can expect our DPS to be lowered by about 65%. For the record, I'm assuming here full epic set of FRR, not the low quality greens and blues. Because let's be real here, casuals are not going to get Sapphiron on week 1, or week 2, or 3. So we're looking at 2,747.5 DPS, considering that Sapphiron will be airborne 35% of the time. And with his 3,164,450 HP, we're looking at a whooping 1,152 seconds fight, or 19 minutes and 12 seconds. That's just way outside of our 15 minutes in rage timer, even with 0 deaths. What all of this means is that for the first time in Classic WoW, casuals will meet a boss that's just, well, mathematically impossible to kill. So our next question is, what is the minimum requirement to defeat Saphiron? Before we can calculate this, we need to establish our boundaries, our actual in-game limitations that will act like an enrage timer. On average, priests and shaman can heal for about 4 minutes in an intensive fight. Paladins will last a bit longer, but don't have AoE healing capabilities. We also must not forget that our raid will need to pop consumables such as Greater Frost Protection Potion, Healthstones, Tuber, so all in all we'll assume a nice clean 5 minutes as our timeline before the raid collapses under the damage taken with 700 HPS. So with Saphiron's 3,164,450 HP and 5 minutes time limit, we can easily establish our first requirement, DPS, which will be 8,702, which takes into account airborne time. Though I had to make an assumption here regarding the melee range DPS split, which will be 50-50. This 8,702 we should round up to 9,000 DPS, just to take into account the players getting ice blocked and a few seconds each time during frost breath where players won't be able to DPS at all. So we have our time limit and DPS minimum to meet that time. The next question is how much our healers can heal during those 5 minutes. This is yet again something tricky to math out, cause it will depend on things such as personal skill, raid composition and gear. So after some discussion with guildies, we've come to an agreement that 700 HPS is possible to output in 5 minutes, which means with our 10 healers setup, we'll need to reduce the total damage taken down to 7,000 DPS, a 60% damage reduction for our DPS, or 255 FRR, which is quite a lot. With 12 healers setup, we're looking at 8,400 total HPS, or 35% damage reduced, and with 14 healers, we'll have 9,800 HPS, or 24.6 damage reduced. With 12 healers setup, our DPS DPS will need to reduce damage taken by 46%, or wear 195 FRR. With our 14 healers setup, we're looking at DPS wearing about 130 FRR. 12 or 14 healers seems like the way to go when it comes to Saphiron for most guilds. Realistically speaking, getting to 150 FRR seems like a good middle of the road number, one that will not require spending months to get, though that will require 14 healers to handle. So, how much DPS do we lose when we equip FRR? This bit is actually very tricky, because it will depend on the piece of item that you've replaced and the item you've replaced it with. For example, if a player replaces his tier 2.5 legs with the green FRR legs, then the DPS loss will be much bigger compared to replacing the legs with the crafted epic FRR legs. So to do the math here, I've used Huhuran and Fenkris. Both bosses have similar HP, so the difference in DPS for any given player should come purely from the usage of an R and its quality. On average, we can expect about 30% DPS loss when using a 150 FRR, so I'll use that as my point of comparison. With 30% less DPS and our overall 9000 DPS requirement to beat Saphiron in 5 minutes, guilds who under normal conditions do 15,585 DPS should be able to down Saphiron. Keep in mind though that in all of my calculations I haven't included Ice Bolt, but that will only add about 4.5 extra DPS to the raid. As you can see, the numbers can be tweaked quite a lot. More FRR doesn't mean less DPS, but also means less HPS, making the fight longer but easing it up on the healers. More healers also means more HPS, but also means less DPS, and so on and so forth. Each guild will need to carefully balance healers and DPS depending on their capabilities. But for the most part, I'd say most guilds, at least initially, will want around 13 to 14 healers with at least 150 to 200 FRR on their DPS. As time goes on and more epic high quality FRR is obtained, guilds will probably choose to drop a healer or two in favor of more DPS with more FRR to make the fight shorter. Before I conclude this video, I wanted to check speedrunning guilds and see if they will be able to go through Sapphiron without FRR. Well, let's calculate this. Looking at Progress's Uruk guild during a speedrun where they popped cooldowns, we can see that their DPS is at around 37k. There's a small downtime because of sweep, Deathwish being a bigger percentage of the fight, and no recklessness, so all in all I'll round it up to a clean 40k total DPS. Their setup included 9 healers. 45 seconds into the fight and they'd have dealt 1.8 million damage to Saphiron, leaving him with 1,364,450 HP when he lands. Since they have no range, I'm gonna assume 0 DPS while in air phase. Once Saphiron lands, they'll need an additional 34 seconds to finish him off, making the fight a total of 114 seconds. Okay, so sub 2 minutes fight. Clearly they have the DPS, but what about the healing? First, we must take into account Diamond Flask healing. We'll use 800 as our healing bonus just to be conservative. Plus 800 healing means our 19 warriors, as per their Uru setup, will do a total of 160 HPS each. We'll also need to add 30 HPS each from pots and such. All in all, from 14,100 DTPS, we have a lot of warriors in Berserk stance, so the average DTPS will be higher, and I did include Ice Bolt this time, will go down to about 9,860 DTPS that our 9 healers will need to handle, or 1,096 HPS each during the first minute. 1 minute into the fight and Diamond Flask will run out, increasing our DTPS up to about 12,900, meaning that from that point onwards our healers will need to do 1,433 HPS for the next 54 seconds. Those numbers seem quite insane, but I believe they are within what's possible for top tier speedrunning guilds. So yeah, it does look like speedrunning guilds, at least on paper, might just be able to clear Saphiron with 0 FRR. Conclusion time. All in all, I'd rate Saphiron as an 11 out of 10 for casuals, as it's just going to be impossible. At the very least, casual guilds will need to have world buffs for Saphiron to even attempt him. For semi-hardcore guilds, at least on release, this fight is a solid 10 out of 10, as they will engage him with green FRR, meaning the fight will be long and that will push their healers to the max.